and announced in a timid voice, "The table is laid, madam. Mrs. White wants to know if you'd like to take a look. You know, make certain everything is laid okay, correctly, and all that." Philippa put down her cards and got up from the table. Richard, playing at the other table, made out as to rise as well. "No, please, I shall be right back." "Oh, but Mrs. Farquhar Fawkes," interjected Mrs. Hampton, "I should love to go with you. I've heard so much about the famous Farquhar flatware." Her two fellow female guests echoed their interest in seeing the dining table laid out for Thanksgiving dinner the next day. Richard quickly ascertained there was no stopping the tide of feminine curiosity. "Oh, go ahead and take them, Philippa. The other gentleman and I will take a stroll out on the patio and indulge in a smoke while you are gone." And as easily as that, it was decided. Philippa led the three women out of the parlor in the direction of the dining room, while Richard led their husbands out the large French doors and onto the paved patio immediately outside. Richard and his companions engaged in the awkward small talk that arises when men are out of their element, with Richard pointing out the ornate Victorian folly 100 yards away and looking spectacularly spectral in the nighttime mist. The Farquhar Folly was an oversized gazebo of the type often erected by the landed gentry for no discernible reason. Its columns shone a ghostly white, while the interior space was hidden in shadow. The men were relieved of finding further social small talk when the women returned, but only for a moment. "Oh, Horace," gushed Mrs. Halifax, "you've got to see how wonderful the dining room looks. That silverware is the most magnificent, the most elegant I've ever seen." Mrs. Hampton and Mrs. Hastings echoed the sentiment, and there was nothing for it but for their obedient husbands to follow their clucking wives back down the hallway and into the dining room. Richard offered Philippa his arm. "Shall we join them?" Philippa took Richard's arm and squeezed it. "Duty calls." In spite of the low light offered by electric wall sconces, the dining room shone with a silver sheen. The Farquhar flatware, polished to perfection, adorned the great table. Heavy forks, salad, dinner, and dessert, spoons, tea and soup, knives, dinner and butter, nestled in their places, accompanied by chafing dishes, gravy boats, butter trays, and more. Two enormous silver candelabras, topped with beautiful tapered white candles, stood at attention above it all. Behind the table stood Mrs. White and young Daphne, with pride shining in their faces, as bright as the silver itself. "It is a remarkable collection, isn't it?" whispered Philippa to Richard. "I suppose it's modest of me to say it, but I don't believe there's a finer set in all of England." Richard's reply was interrupted before he began. "What's a pile of silverware like this worth, Mrs. Farquhar Fawkes?" asked Mr. Hampton. His wife attempted to shush him. "Horace, that's such an impolite thing to ask. What will our hostess think?" "That's quite all right, Mrs. Hampton," Philippa reassured her guest. It's a common question." She turned to the woman's husband. "There really is no way to put a value on the collection, Mr. Hampton. You see, it's entailed." "What's that mean?" asked Mr. Hastings, adjusting his pince-nez for a closer look. I'm guessing it's the little pinched nose glasses. "It means that it's a part of the Farquhar Farms estate, just as the manor house and the gardens. None of them may be sold by themselves." "And the Farquhar Folly," added Mrs. Halifax. "Don't forget your wonderful Folly." "Yes, of course, the Folly too," Philippa answered, then added in a low voice to Richard, "No matter how many times I try to forget that frightful monstrosity." After a few more minutes of dutiful admiration of the Farquhar flatware and speculation towards the dinner planned for the next evening, The guests collectively decided it was time for bed and departed. After a few more minutes, oh, sorry, skipped backwards paragraph. Mrs. White, said Philippa, you and Daphne should go to bed too. We've all got a big day ahead of us tomorrow. The two servants curtsied and left by way of the connecting door to the kitchen, leaving Richard and Philippa alone. Richard caught Philippa gazing at the silver on the table. Would you sell it if you could? I honestly don't know, Richard. There's a part of me that never wants to see Farquhar Farms sold. Any piece of it, really, even the folly. She gave him a rueful smile. Besides, I'm lucky that it is entailed. If it hadn't been, what spendthrift husband of mine would have sold or pawned it as he did with everything else on which he could get his hands? She looked towards the grand stairway visible through the wide pocket doors, and up which her guest had recently ascended. And now, because of him, my only hope to keep Farquhar Farms is to ensure our guests have a cracking good time. Richard pulled Philippa toward him. Have faith, my pet. Things will work themselves out for the best. I have the utmost confidence in you. And with those words, he reached out with his cane and pushed the button that switched off the pale electric wall sconces and cast the room in a comfortable darkness. November mornings in the country are quite quiet as a rule. The storied songbirds of English lore fled to warmer climes, and naught but raucous crows remained to greet the weak daylight the rising winter sun brings. But that morning's calm was shattered by the sound of a woman screaming. Nor was it just any woman, for those screams were achingly familiar to all those who had witnessed yesterday's unfortunate occurrence. In his guest room on the second floor, Richard Barrington thrust his feet into slippers and tugged on his robe. He picked up his cane and, as fast as he could, he hurried down the hall, then the stairs, and then went down the back hallway to the kitchen. I swear, he muttered under his breath as he stomped along, if I ever have occasion to hire a cook, she's going to be a mute. He burst into the kitchen and stopped short. It was empty. Richard cocked his head to one side, listening intently. A low crooning sound had replaced the screams, and they were coming from the dining room. Through the swinging door from the kitchen, Richard pushed open the door and went in. Mrs. White was seated in a chair at the dining room table, her head buried in her ample arms. Richard walked over. Mrs. White, what on earth is the matter? He looked at the clock on the sideboard. Do you realize it's only 6:30 in the morning? Mrs. White raised her tear-streaked face. They're gone. They're all gone. What's gone, Mrs. White? Oh, my God, they're gone. Richard turned to see Philippa. She had just entered from the main hall, clutching a thin and mostly transparent wrap over her pajamas. Richard followed her stricken gaze to the table, and then did he comprehend the problem. The Farquhar flatware, worth a fortune, and indeed about the only thing of value left in the Farquhar estate, so lovingly polished and laid out for the day's dinner, was gone. Every last fork, spoon, knife, and accessory. All that remained were the candles from the twin candelabras, cast in a haphazard heap upon the naked table. Take a drink. An hour later, Constable Pratt bicycled into view. Richard greeted him at the manor entrance. Well, Constable, I can't say that I'm pleased to see you. The constable removed his helmet. No, I'm certain you are not, sir. And when you hear what I have to tell you, you'll be even less so. Richard raised his eyebrow at this. I had a call from the police surgeon this morning. That's why I'm later than I ought to be in getting out here. And young Rosemary was drugged. That's why she fell asleep in the butter. Drugged? That's preposterous! Richard became aware of someone approaching him from behind and he lowered his voice. Is he certain? Is who certain about what? Philippa asked, for it was her footsteps Richard had heard behind him. Well, began the constable, looking at Richard for guidance. Go ahead, Constable Pratt. This is Mrs. Farquhar Fawkes' home, and she deserves to hear the truth of what's going on. The constable, turning his helmet in his hands, related the gist of the conversation with the police surgeon. So you're saying she was murdered? That's the nut of it, isn't it? Demanded Richard. Why on earth would anyone want to kill her? Perhaps she saw something she oughtn't have, suggested Constable Pratt. That's the stuff of American gangster movies, Philippa retorted. That sort of thing doesn't happen here in England. Her face grew pale and she turned to Richard. But it has, hasn't it? It was decided between the three of them that Constable Pratt would begin his investigation of the missing flatware forthwith, and that there was no need to mention the cause of Rosemary's death to the guests. A flying squad, so the constable told them with a hint of awe in his voice, was driving down from London to conduct a proper investigation of both incidents. But in the meantime, he proposed to poke around the house in hopes of finding a clue or two. Do you think it's proper to let him sniff about? Asked Philippa of Richard in a low voice as they watched the constable head toward the dining room. Not really, but he probably can't do much harm. We can ask young Daphne to assist him. That way they'll be too busy with each other. Too busy with each other to cause any trouble. Philippa stopped short. That's what I meant to tell people when I came downstairs. And that's what I meant to tell you when I came downstairs. I can't wake Daphne. She's sound asleep in her bed, snoring to beat the band. Philippa put her hand to her mouth. Richard, she must have been drugged just as Rosemary was. A determined look came over Richard's face. My God, Philippa, if I ever lay my hands on whoever's doing this. Philippa put her hand on his arm. I'll call Dr. Carlson from the village. In the meantime, perhaps you can keep the guests from guessing there's been another mishap. And such was his concern for Philippa that he took on the onerous task. Mm. Very slowly eating my dinner under watchful eyes over here. Okay. Oh, what? Okay. Mm. Sorry, guys. Shortly after noon, Richard found Philippa standing by herself in the parlor, staring out the French windows. He crossed the room to her. She turned to him, and he saw how worried she was. Oh, Richard, what am I to do? The weekend has turned into a disaster. I just know the guests will want their money back, and who could blame them? Well, I haven't anything good to add. The flying squad from Scotland Yard has yet to arrive. Constable Pratt's been on the telephone a half-dozen times this morning trying to find out what's keeping them. Philippa sighed. The only good news is that Dr. Carlson says Daphne should have no ill effects when she wakens, which he says should be late this afternoon. Richard took her hands, and the two turned to look out the window and across the wide lawn to where the colonnaded folly stood, shrouded in wisps of lingering morning fog. Look at it, Richard, demanded Philippa. Farquhar's folly, an everlasting emblem of my foolish family. Long after I sell out to the land trust and move away, that wretched, ugly building will stand as a reminder. And here, all this time, I thought you loved the ridiculous thing, said Richard. What are you doing, buddy? Hi. You gonna try to make it up here? Be careful. Are you daft? Every time there's a storm, I hope the damn thing falls down. Thank you, Pooty. Then why do you pay for all the repair work that's been done to it? Ads in about a minute, guys. That wasn't my doing. The local historical people did all that work. All of it volunteer. The locals love it. Constable Pratt himself supervised and spent hours on his own slaving over it, the wretched thing. I certainly wouldn't have, even if I could have afforded it. Richard stared out across the lawn at the folly. A thought was forming in his mind. Philippa, my pet. She looked up at him, and he was startled by the smile spreading across his face. He lifted her hand and gave it a light kiss across her fingers. I do believe I got it. Shortly before 4 p.m., the assembled guests, staff, and others waited in eager anticipation for Richard to begin speaking. Well, we'll pause right there because ads are about to pop up here any second. Careful, buddy. Be careful, TJ. What? Be careful, TJ. Your balance probably isn't the best right now. Yeah, your balance probably isn't the best. Okay. There's my itty bitty.
Yells loudly and bats at the screen. Aw, mom's taking a break. But don't worry, it'll be back soon with more snacks. Meow.
Ugh. Hey, you. Come here. Careful. Oops. Uh-oh. Fuck evil done. Yeah, Papa Eagle's done. No further dishes. Work. Cracker Jack. Going. Way to go, Grace. I told you your balance wasn't the best right now. Yeah, you need to lay down and relax now. Uh-oh. What's going on with Papa Woody's? Is he done? Nope, he's still going. Or have we rated out? Nope, Papa Woody's is still
Yawns
going.
loudly and stretches out MRRO. So Sleepy need more treats and cuddles to stay awake. Snuggles up and purrs.
Are you going to come here? Come here. Hi. Come here. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay, sweet pie. It's okay. Goofus. Welcome back from ads, everybody. Just let everybody know I am still about and getting rid of chats that don't need to know. Pretty still going. Lobster still going. Pretty still going. No clue who Mr. Coco Crisp is or who Bad Panda is. Alright, so. I know I am. I just want y'all to see who all I'm supporting, so. There's Mr. Darren. Mr. Loprington. Ben Fable. Oh look, it's that foolish warlock guy. Those people up, relax. Darkleberg. Toby, Alice. Whoops, no, not in a separate window. Thank you very much. Kirby Carnage. Ducky. Poppy Bear's back up. Miss Janie. Tamar. Bouquet Middle. Techman J. So we just go around spreading a few lurks. You want some garlic bread? Oh, Dirkleberg's just now done. Okay. Thank you, Yoga, DJ Yoga. Derpy Carnage. Ducky. Poppy Bear alert. She's in here. Miss Janie. Mar. Bouquet Bizzle. I want some garlic bread now, dang it. Techman J. And we're back to Kitty Toby. And Red Rum and all them. Who we just did, so. See, all done. You're... Oh my gosh, DJ, how come I wasn't following you? Now you're followed. Sorry about that, DJ. Oh, how I missed you. Thank you, Chris. Okay. Shortly before 4 p.m., the assembled guests, staff, and others waited in eager anticipation for Richard to begin speaking. They were in the parlor with extra chairs brought in from the dining room to accommodate their number. Richard gave a quick glance toward Philippa and received a reassuring nod in return. "If I may have your attention," he began. The murmur of quiet conversation ceased as all eyes turned toward Richard. He swallowed and continued. "With the permission of Constable Pratt." He paused and nodded toward where that personage stood by the large French windows. As if he were conducting an orchestra, all eyes followed his to the constable, who gave a small wave, while his eyes darted from side to side. Then all attention returned to Richard. "With his permission, I propose to answer the questions of who killed Rosemary, what happened to Daphne, and who stole the Farquhar flatware." His statement had the expected effect, and it took several minutes for order to be brought again, helped by the serving of some of the Farquhar share. "Thank you, Chris." "First, let me explain some faulty thinking that steered me and others in the wrong direction. We've been trying to figure out why Farquhar Farms had been plagued with dead and unconscious maids. Why was Rosemary murdered and Daphne drugged? Above all, why would anyone go around knocking off and drugging housemaids? Surely the most inoffensive member of a household staff. That question and reasoning took us far afield from the truth." He paused and looked around the room. "Poor Rosemary wasn't killed for something she may have overheard or witnessed. She died simply because she was a housemaid." Richard held up his hands to fend off the multitude of questions and expressions of amazement and doubt that cascaded over him at those words. "But what about Daphne?" asked Philippa. "Why was Daphne drugged?" "Have no fear for Daphne's safety." He stole a look at the clock over the mantelpiece. "Unless I miss my guess, the drug she took should be wearing off soon." It took a moment for his words to sink in. The, the drug she took? Richard, are you saying Daphne drugged herself?" "Yes, Philippa, that's exactly what I'm saying. She did it so as to avoid any suspicion of involvement with the theft of the Farquhar flatware. Isn't that right, Constable Pratt?" Constable Pratt's face whitened, and he made an effort to escape through the French doors, finding them locked. Uh, through the French doors. Finding them locked, he put his shoulder to the flimsy wood, forced them open, and rushed outside. The others in the room watched in open-mouthed amazement as he disappeared into the late afternoon gloom. Then whistles shrilled and voices could be heard shouting. A minute later, Constable Pratt, now in handcuffs, was marched into the room by three men in trench coats and bowler hats. One had custody of the woeful-looking Pratt, while the other two carried large rucksacks that clanked and clanged when set on the floor. "Allow me to introduce Detective Sergeant Keyes of Scotland Yard. I called them myself once I realized Pratt had only faked calling them himself." Richard turned to the newcomers. "I hope you didn't have too chilly a wait, Sergeant." The senior of the three doffed his hat. "No trouble at all, sir, and well worth it to put our hands on a rotter like this one." "And the Farquhar flatware?" Sergeant Keyes gestured to the rucksacks. "Hidden beneath the floorboards of the folly, just as you had suspected." "Oh, thank heavens!" exclaimed Philippa. "Let's get them to the dining room. We've just enough time to set them on the table for dinner." All present, including the American guests, pitched in to reset the table. At last it was time to serve dinner. It began with roasted parsnip and pear soup, and lemon thyme bread on the side. When that course was finished, the turkey was brought from the kitchen. It shone with a tangerine glaze and had a sage and sweet sausage stuffing waiting inside. Sweet potatoes, gravy, corn, and watercress made up the side dishes. As all enjoyed themselves with the sumptuous dinner, Richard explained the mystery of its solution to the guests. And so you see, he concluded, Pratt had been planning the theft of the Farquhar flatware for months. Hence his devotion to the work on the Folly. All that time he was secretly building a hiding place for the flatware. He figured on leaving it there until it was safe to sell on the black market. And Daphne? Asked Philippa. His willing accomplice. He drugged Rosemary when she brought items for the dinner from her mother's shop. The plan was to simply cause her to miss work so that Daphne could be brought in as a replacement. But the poor girl was dedicated to her work and tried to work the butter late that night as she had promised Mrs. White, and fell asleep face down in it. Pratt and Daphne stole the silverware together. Then Daphne dosed herself with sleeping powders to avoid suspicion. Halfway through the dinner, the Reverend Rogers arrived. Late, as usual, but most appreciative of the superlative supper that greeted him. But the good vicar of Wickersham was most perplexed by the horrified looks that crossed the faces of his dining companions, when in all innocence, and with a mouthful of freshly buttered bread, he asked, "Do I detect a hint of rosemary in the butter?" "Yes, vicar, you do,"